In the crisp autumn afternoon of October 28, 1985, 10-year-old Leo Miller, with his blue school bag bouncing on his back, walked out of his elementary school in the quiet town of Oakhaven and was never seen again. For 30 years, his disappearance was a ghost that haunted the community. His family was left with nothing but crushing silence and a case with no witnesses, no suspects, and no leads. The trail, it seemed, had been erased forever, that is, until 2015. During the demolition of the now-abandoned school, a construction worker's sledgehammer broke through a wall in the old art classroom, revealing a dusty object that had been sealed in darkness for 3 decades. It was Leo Miller's school bag, but what they found inside would not only solve the 30-year-old mystery of his disappearance, it would expose the monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Inside a sunlit kitchen on Maple Avenue, Sarah Miller was packing a school lunch. Her 10-year-old son, Leo, suddenly burst into the room, full of a restless energy that seemed to power his vivid imagination. He slid a spiral notebook across the breakfast table, his eyes wide with pride. He announced to his mother that he had just finished the 3rd chapter of his homemade comic book, The Adventures of Commander Comet. Sarah picked it up and smiled, looking through the hand-drawn panels of a brave space explorer battling aliens. She praised his work, telling him it was amazing and that the villains, the asteroid pirates, didn't stand a chance against his hero. As Leo grabbed a piece of toast, his 16-year-old brother, David, entered the kitchen with the cool indifference of a teenager. He gestured toward Leo's simple blue canvas school bag, which had a hand-sewn patch of a rocket ship blasting into space. David teased his younger brother, asking if Commander Comet wasn't due for a new ship, remarking that the patched one looked like it might fall apart. Leo defended his creation, proudly explaining that the patch wasn't a flaw, it was a feature containing special retro thrusters to make the bag go faster. It was a fleeting, meaningless moment of brotherly banter, a snapshot of a normal morning that would later be replayed endlessly in their minds, distorted by the weight of grief. Leo's walk to Oakhaven Elementary was a familiar journey. He knew every crack in the sidewalk and every gnarled tree root along the way. His day at school unfolded with the same comforting routine as always, ending with his favorite class, art. In the art room, surrounded by the smell of clay and paint, Leo was completely absorbed in his watercolor painting of a distant galaxy. In the background, a figure moved through the room, a man who was part of the school's scenery, yet remained almost invisible. Arthur Gable, the school janitor, was a gaunt, quiet man in his late 40s. He swept the floors in silence, his gaze occasionally drifting over the children. He was a ghost in the school's daily machinery, a man who saw everything but was seen by no one. For a moment, his eyes rested on Leo, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he turned back to his work. The final bell rang, and the school erupted in the joyful chaos of dismissal. Leo carefully packed his painting into his blue school bag alongside his Commander Comet notebook. At the school gates, he met his best friend, Mark, and they excitedly discussed their Halloween plans. At the corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue, they parted ways with the familiar, "See you tomorrow." It was the last time any of Leo's friends or family would hear his voice. The narrative follows Leo as he turned onto his street, just 4 blocks from home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the sidewalk in stripes of light and darkness. He walked past the familiar houses, turned the final corner onto a stretch of sidewalk lined with tall hedges, took one step, then another, and then he was gone. The street was suddenly empty and silent, the only sound being the rustle of autumn leaves. Back at the Miller house, the kitchen clock ticked loudly. 3:30 p.m. became 4 hours p.m. The first seed of worry was planted in Sarah's mind. Leo was never late. She looked out the window to an empty street. A call to Mark's house confirmed Leo had never arrived. Her worry began to sprout, twisting in her stomach as she made more calls, each one returning the same answer. David came home from football practice to find his mother pacing, her growing fear quickly dissolving his own teenage nonchalance. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the warm autumn light was replaced by a cold, menacing twilight. The safe, familiar town suddenly felt threatening. At 6:15 p.m., with her son's dinner sitting untouched on the table, Sarah Miller could no longer deny the terror that had bloomed inside her. With shaking hands, she dialed 911. Her voice, breaking into a desperate whisper, uttered the words that would define the rest of her life. Her son was missing. A normal Monday in a perfect town had just fractured, plunging a family into a nightmare from which they would not awaken for 30 years. The arrival of the first police car shattered the quiet grief of the Miller household. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the neighborhood's placid facade, painting the tranquil homes in jarring strokes of emergency. The initial response was a flurry of frantic, hopeful action. Police officers, led by a seasoned detective named Frank Harris, began an immediate search. Neighbors poured out of their houses, armed with flashlights and a desperate need to help, their beams cutting through the darkness of the nearby woods. A community once defined by its sense of security was now united in fear. As hours turned into days, the search became more organized, but no less desperate. The town of Oakhaven mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers combed through fields and forests in methodical grid. Searches. Leo Miller's smiling school picture was suddenly everywhere, his face taped to telephone poles, taped to the windows of the grocery store, and held by strangers on the evening news. The town's innocence was cracking under the strain of the unthinkable. For Detective Harris, a weary cop who had seen his share of darkness, the pressure was immense. Every passing hour felt like a personal failure. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the investigation took its first, critical, wrong turn. A nervous resident from a neighboring town came forward, convinced he had seen a boy matching Leo's description, being pulled into a rusty, windowless van. The witness was sincere, but his memory was flawed, a composite of half-seen moments and the power of suggestion. Nevertheless, for an investigation with no other leads, this phantom van became a tangible hope. Detective Harris, against his better judgment but starved for a breakthrough, diverted significant resources to the chase. The focus shifted from the town of Oakhaven to the state's highways and rest stops. The faces of known offenders who drove similar vehicles were scrutinized. For weeks, the van theory consumed the investigation, while the real trail, located just a few hundred feet from where Leo was last seen, grew colder with every passing day. During the peak of the van hunt, the procedural work of routine interviews continued. Hundreds of people were questioned, teachers, students, neighbors, and school staff. Among them was Arthur Gable, the quiet school janitor. In a small, sterile room at the police station, he sat across from Detective Harris. Gable was withdrawn and awkward, his answers short and direct. He claimed he had been home with a severe case of the flu on the day Leo disappeared. His wife, a timid woman who seemed to shrink in her chair, corroborated his story completely. She confirmed that he had been in bed all day, sick and miserable, with no evidence to the contrary, and a high-profile van search demanding his attention. Harris dismissed Gable as just another of the town's odd but harmless residents. It was a footnote in a massive case file, a missed clue of catastrophic proportions. The most monstrous truths, after all, are often hidden behind the most mundane and believable of lies. Time, indifferent to human suffering, moved on. The frantic energy of the first few weeks faded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. The seasons changed. The flyers with Leo's face yellowed and tore in the wind and rain, eventually disappearing altogether. Years began to stack one upon the other. The case of the missing boy slowly transformed from a current event into a local legend. a ghost story parents told their children to make them wary of strangers. For the Oak Haven Police Department, Leo Miller's file was relegated to a cold case, a box in a storage room collecting dust, a symbol of a promise they couldn't keep. But for the Miller family, time brought no such distance. The year 2015 looked nothing like 1985, yet for them it was always that same autumn afternoon. Sarah Miller, now in her late 60s, lived her life around a hollow core of grief. Leo's bedroom remained a perfect shrine to the boy he was. The Commander Comet drawings were still taped to the wall, his model spaceship still hung from the ceiling, and his bed was always made, as if waiting for his return. It was a room frozen in time, a physical manifestation of a mother's refusal to let go of the last tangible pieces of her son. David Miller, the teasing older brother, was now a man in his late 40s with a family of his own. The trauma of his brother's disappearance had shaped him into an anxious, overprotective father. He was haunted by the ghost of the brother he couldn't save, the guilt over their last trivial interaction, a silent weight he carried every day. He saw danger in every shadow, a potential threat to the children he was terrified of failing. The family's arrested grief was most palpable in their quiet, somber rituals. On what would have been Leo's 40th birthday, there was no celebration. Instead, Sarah, David, and his family gathered around the old kitchen table. Sarah placed a single cupcake in the center of the table and lit a single candle. No songs were sung. There were no words to say. There was only the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty chair, a silence filled with the crushing presence of the person who wasn't there. It was a moment that encapsulated 3 decades of loss, a story without an end. They were a family trapped in the amber of that one Monday in 1985, waiting for a resolution that, it seemed, would never come. 30 years after its halls fell silent, Oak Haven Elementary School was a skeleton of its former self. Windows were boarded up, paint was peeling, and the once vibrant playground was surrendering to weeds. The building stood as a derelict monument to a forgotten time, a place of ghosts slated for demolition to make way for a new condominium development. In the summer of 2015, a demolition crew was tasked with tearing it down piece by piece. Among them were 2 men, Marco and Vince, ordinary guys earning a paycheck, their conversation a casual back and forth about weekend plans and the summer heat. Their job that afternoon was to clear the interior walls of the ground floor. The building's old art room, a place that once echoed with the laughter of children, was now just another space to be gutted. Vince swung a heavy sledgehammer against a plaster wall, the impacts punctuated by the crunch of crumbling drywall. But then one of his swings produced a different sound. Not the solid thud of plaster on brick, but a deep, hollow boom that vibrated through the floor. He paused, lowering the hammer. The 2 men exchanged a curious glance. Marco ran his hand over the wall, knocking on it and confirming the hollow space behind it. Prying away the damaged plasterboard with a crowbar, they revealed a dark, dusty cavity within the wall, a space that should not have been there. A musty, stale air escaped from the opening. Marco pulled out his phone and switched on its flashlight, aiming the bright beam into the darkness. The light caught on a patch of faded blue canvas. Their casual worksite banter died instantly, replaced by a thick, uneasy silence. Carefully, Marco reached into the void and pulled the object out into the light. It was a child's schoolbag from another era, impossibly old and coated in a thick, uniform layer of dust, as if it had been sealed away from the world for a lifetime. As Marco wiped away some of the grime, they saw it. A hand-sewn patch of a rocket ship, its colors faded, but its shape unmistakable. They didn't know the story of Leo Miller, but they knew what they had found. This wasn't lost. It was hidden. This wasn't a discovery. It was an exhumation. A heavy understanding passed between them, and Marco made the call. This time there were no flashing lights painting the street, no frantic neighborhood search, just a single unmarked car that pulled up to the demolition site. From it emerged Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, methodical detective who had grown up in the shadow of the Leo Miller case. It was a local legend, a cautionary tale, the kind of mystery every cop hoped to one day solve. She approached the scene with a quiet reverence, understanding that the dusty blue bag being held out to her was not just evidence, it was a time capsule. Back at the station, in a clean, well-lit evidence room, Rossi began the delicate process of opening the bag. She catalogued its contents with meticulous care. A small, dented thermos, a surprisingly well-preserved petrified apple, a Star Wars pencil case, its plastic cracked with age. Then she found the spiral notebook. She opened it carefully, its pages stiff and yellowed. The first few pages were filled with the innocent, imaginative drawings of Commander Comet. As she gently turned a page, a single folded piece of paper, not belonging to the notebook, fluttered out onto the table. The paper was crinkled and worn. Rossi unfolded it. The drawing inside was crude, rendered in the shaky hand of a child, but its content was deeply disturbing. It depicted a small stick figure being led away from a building by a much larger, menacing one. And below the larger figure, scrawled in crayon, was a name, Mr. Gable. Rossi stared at the name, the first tangible lead in 30 years. As she examined the disturbing drawing, she noticed something else, something that had been pressed between the notebook's pages, like a forgotten bookmark. A single long strand of dark hair. Detective Rossi knew what she had to do next. She looked up Sarah Miller's phone number, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this call would unleash a storm of emotion 30 years in the making. In her quiet house across town, Sarah's peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the ringing phone. Rossi's voice was professional yet gentle. She identified herself and explained, calmly and clearly, that a discovery had been made during the demolition of the old school. They had found Leo's school bag. On the other end of the line, Sarah Miller was silent. For a moment she couldn't breathe. It wasn't the relief she might have once dreamed of, nor the simple pain she had grown accustomed to. It was a tidal wave of every emotion she had, suppressed for 3 decades, all rising at once. A terrifying, electrifying surge of hope, so powerful it felt like pain, and beneath it, a profound dread of the answers that might follow, of a truth that could be even worse than the long, agonizing silence. The wall she had built around her heart for 30 years had just been breached. The discovery of that school bag in such an unlikely place left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item can rewrite history. If you, like me, are fascinated by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. The discovery of the school bag sent a shockwave through the Oakhaven Police Department. The cold case of Leo Miller, long relegated to a dusty box in a storage room, was now active. The file, a thick stack of typewritten pages yellowed with age, was brought into the bright, modern world of the 21st century precinct. It was a study in contrasts. The old investigation, built on eyewitness testimony and instinct, was about to collide with the new world of forensic science, a world of certainty and data. For Detective Isabella Rossi, this was no longer about revisiting the past. It was about dissecting it with tools her predecessors could only have dreamed of. The investigation now centered on 2 impossible clues that had survived 3 decades in darkness: the crudely drawn picture and the single strand of hair. The hair, once a useless detail, was now the investigation's most promising asset. It was carefully packaged and sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. There, forensic technicians would begin the painstaking process of extracting a DNA profile. In 1985, this would have been science fiction. Now the lab could potentially retrieve a full genetic blueprint from the single follicle. an invisible code that could definitively identify the person it belonged to. It was a modern miracle, the chance to give a ghost from the past a name. Simultaneously, the drawing was analyzed by forensic specialists. They confirmed the age of the paper and the crayon wax, affirming that it was a genuine artifact from the era. But the most critical piece of information was the name scrawled at the bottom, Mr. Gable. A name that had been a minor footnote in the original investigation was now the central pillar of the new one. The contents of the bag were also meticulously processed for latent fingerprints. In the dry, stable environment of the sealed wall, it was possible that a print could have survived. Each page of the Commander Comet notebook was carefully dusted, each item from the pencil case examined, in the hopes of finding one more piece to the puzzle. With this new evidence in hand, the official narrative of Leo's disappearance, which had stood for 30 years, crumbled to dust. The location of the bag was the most damning fact. Being sealed inside a wall of the school was undeniable proof that Leo Miller had never left the school grounds that day. The suspicious van theory, the phantom lead that had consumed hundreds of hours of police work and sent investigators chasing shadows across the state, was officially and finally discarded. The tragic irony was not lost on Rossi's team. While the entire police force of 1985 was looking for a predator on the open road, the truth was entombed just yards from the art room where Leo was last seen alive. Detective Rossi and her team immersed themselves in the original case file, hoping to see the old facts through a new lens. They read through hundreds of dead-end leads and witness statements, and then they found it. A brief, 2-page report detailing the interview with Arthur Gable. They read the original detective's notes, describing the janitor as odd and withdrawn. They saw the ironclad alibi he presented. He was home sick with the flu, and right below it, the signature of the person who provided that alibi, his wife, Eleanor Gable. The name from the child's drawing now had a story, a weak spot in a 3-decade-old lie. The next step was to find out what had become of Arthur Gable. In 1985, this would have involved weeks of sifting through paper records and making long-distance phone calls. In 2015, it took Detective Rossi less than 5 minutes. A few keystrokes into a series of national databases revealed everything. Arthur Gable, now 78 years old, was a widower living a quiet, reclusive life in a small town in neighboring Washington. The database also provided another critical detail. He had taken early retirement and sold his house in Oak Haven in late 1986, just 1 year after Leo Miller disappeared. To Rossi, this was a significant red flag. People with clean consciences didn't typically uproot their entire lives so soon after being tangentially connected to a major crime investigation. The fog of the past was beginning to clear. The scattered, confusing pieces were finally starting to form a coherent picture. They had an odd, reclusive man who was present at the scene of the crime. They had his name on a disturbing drawing hidden with the victim's belongings. And now they had a suspicious pattern of behavior in the year following the disappearance. The case was no longer cold. For the first time in 30 years, there was a single, clear path forward. The trail led directly to Arthur Gable's front door. The long, silent wait for answers was over. The hunt had begun. The drive from Oak Haven, Oregon, to the small, sleepy town in Washington felt like a journey back in time. Detective Rossi and her partner traveled with the weight of 30 years of silence sitting in their back seat. They found Arthur Gable's home on a quiet, unassuming street. It was a small, meticulously kept house with a perfectly manicured lawn and cheerful flower beds, a facade of harmless normalcy. The man who answered the door matched the house perfectly. He was frail, with thin white hair and pale, watery eyes. He leaned on a cane, the picture of a harmless senior citizen, a stark contrast to the monster Rossi had begun to build in her mind. Inside, Gable was calm and cooperative, almost detached. He claimed his memory of that specific time in 1985 was foggy, lost in the haze of decades past. When Rossi presented him with a copy of the disturbing drawing, he simply gave a tired sigh. He dismissed it as a cruel childhood prank, explaining that he had always been a quiet man, and that children often invent stories about those they don't understand. He calmly reiterated his original alibi, a story he had clearly recited to himself for years. He was home with a terrible flu, and his dear wife, Eleanor, God rest her soul, had been by his side the entire time. He was a fortress of quiet denial, and they left his house with nothing more than their own deepening suspicions. His performance was flawless, leaving them with no cracks to exploit. To ensure due diligence, Rossi's team explored the only other possibility. The name Mr. G on the drawing, however unlikely, could have pointed to someone else. They discovered a former gym teacher, a Mr. Grayson, had also worked at the school in 1985. The team spent days tracking him down, finally locating him in a retirement community in Florida, but the lead evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. Mr. Grayson's travel records and witness statements from his family confirmed he had been on a cruise for the entire week of Leo Miller's disappearance. The brief detour, while a dead end, served to sharpen their focus. Every path they explored led them right back to Arthur Gable. Frustrated by Gable's stone wall of denial, Rossi knew that forensics alone might not be enough to secure a conviction. She needed to rebuild the human story of that day. She decided to re-interview the children who were now adults, starting with Leo's best friend, Mark. Mark, now a middle-aged father, was emotional as he recounted his memories. Of Leo, the final goodbye at the street corner was seared into his mind. Rossi showed him the drawing. He stared at it for a long time, a look of confusion on his face. He told her that he didn't recognize it, that Leo's drawings of Commander Comet were heroic and clean, not dark and unsettling like this one. But as he continued to stare at the crude, shadowy figures, something flickered in his memory. He said the style reminded him of another classmate, a quiet, withdrawn girl who rarely spoke to anyone, a girl named Clara Benson. He recalled that she was always hunched over a sketchbook, but her drawings were different. They were full of monsters and strange, scary things. The name was a jolt of electricity through the investigation. Running Clara Benson through their databases, they found her almost immediately. She was now Clara Joyce, a successful graphic novelist living in Portland, renowned for a dark, gothic art style that was celebrated for its unsettling beauty. The connection was undeniable. Rossi knew she had found the artist. The interview took place in Clara's Portland art studio, a space that felt like a physical extension of her work, filled with beautiful, melancholic art. When Rossi first presented the drawing, Clara became defensive. She was hesitant, claiming she didn't remember that time well, that it was all a blur. The trauma of her childhood had been buried under a thick layer of time and denial. But Rossi was patient and gentle. She didn't push or accuse. She simply left the copy of the drawing on the table between them, a silent testament to a secret that had been kept for 30 years. The sight of her own childhood creation, a message in a bottle that had never been received, finally broke through Clara's defenses. Her composure crumbled, and tears streamed down her face as the repressed memories of that autumn afternoon came flooding back. She confessed everything. She told Rossi that she had been a shy, invisible girl, often staying late in the art room to avoid the other children. On that day, after the final bell, she had hidden in a corner to finish a drawing. She saw Mr. Gable approach Leo near the classroom door. She heard him tell Leo in a low, conspiratorial voice that he had a secret to show him, something special, in the janitor's closet just off the art room. She saw Leo's hesitation, and then she saw him follow the janitor into the shadows of the hallway. An instinctual, paralyzing fear kept her frozen. In her hiding spot, The next morning, she arrived at school consumed with a terrible unspoken fear. She knew something was wrong. In a desperate, childish attempt to send a warning, she drew the picture of what she had witnessed. During recess, she slipped the drawing into Leo's blue school bag, which was still hanging in his cubby outside the classroom. She had hoped he would find it and understand that he was in danger, but her hope turned to terror later that day when she saw Mr. Gable quietly take the school bag from the cubby. She was a scared 9-year-old girl, too terrified of the silent, menacing janitor to ever tell a soul. Her confession was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. It was the human testimony that forensics could never provide. They now had more than a suspect and a collection of circumstantial evidence. They had an eyewitness who could place Arthur Gable with Leo Miller in the final moments before he vanished forever. Clara's testimony was the key that unlocked the past. With her chilling eyewitness account, the scattered pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place, revealing a horrifyingly simple picture of what happened on that autumn afternoon in 1985. Arthur Gable, the predator hiding in plain sight, had used his position of trust to his advantage. He was the invisible man of the school, the one who saw everything but was never truly noticed. He saw an opportunity in Leo Miller, a quiet, imaginative boy who could be easily led. He lured him back to the deserted art room with the promise of a secret. What happened inside that room could only be pieced together through the lens of Gable's dark psychology. Leo, likely realizing he was in a dangerous situation, must have resisted. He must have tried to leave, perhaps tried to scream for help. In that moment, Gable's predatory fantasy collided with reality. Fearing exposure, he would have been thrown into a violent panic. The act was not a carefully premeditated murder, but a frantic, desperate silencing of the one person who could expose him. That same night, under the cover of his routine janitorial duties, he used his tools, his knowledge of the old building, and the cloak of darkness to create a tomb. He sealed Leo's body, along with his blue school bag, inside the art room wall, confident his secret was buried forever. Just as Detective Rossi prepared to confront Gable with this narrative, the final piece of the forensic puzzle arrived from the state crime lab. The DNA results from the single strand of hair were in. For a moment, the report seemed like a setback. The DNA did not belong to Arthur Gable, but the lab, following standard procedure, had run the profile against known relatives for context. They had found a match. The DNA belonged to Eleanor Gable, his wife, who had been dead for over a decade. The very person who had provided Gable's alibi was now, through the silent testimony of her own DNA, inextricably linked to the crime scene. The alibi had just become the evidence. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Rossi and her partner drove back to Washington. This time, they were not there to ask questions. They were there to get answers. They found Gable in his garden, tending to his roses, a picture of tranquil retirement. Rossi began calmly, laying out Clara's testimony in vivid, unshakable detail. She described what the young girl had seen, what she had heard, and the drawing she had created in fear. Gable, though his hands trembled slightly, held his ground. He dismissed the story as the decades-old fantasy of a troubled child, a pathetic attempt to find relevance by inserting herself into a famous tragedy. He was dismissive, almost arrogant in his denial. He fell back on his ultimate defense, the shield he had hidden behind for 30 years. He insisted he was home, sick in bed. He invoked the memory of his sainted wife, his loyal Eleanor, who had cared for him and could have attested to his innocence. It was the moment Rossi had been waiting for. She let him finish, then paused, allowing the silence to hang in the air. She then calmly told him about the single strand of hair they had found, carefully preserved within Leo's notebook. She explained how they had extracted a DNA profile from it. Then she delivered the final, devastating blow. "It wasn't your hair we found in the bag, Arthur," she said, her voice steady and clear. It was Eleanor's. The name of his wife, once his shield, now became the weapon that undid him. Gable's carefully maintained facade, held in place for over 10,000 days, finally shattered. He physically deflated, the strength seeming to drain from his body, leaving a frail, withered old man in its place. The fight was gone. And then he began to talk. The story tumbled out, a torrent of poison that had been suppressed for a lifetime. He confessed that he had lured Leo back to the classroom. He claimed the boy got scared and tried to scream. In a panic, Gable had covered the boy's mouth to silence him, and in the struggle he had gone too far. It was an accident, he insisted, his voice a pathetic whine. But he didn't stop there. He revealed the final, darkest secret of all. That evening, his wife Eleanor had come to the school to bring him dinner. She found him in a state of pure panic with the body of the dead child. He confessed everything to her, and Eleanor, in a twisted, horrifying act of spousal loyalty, made a choice. Instead of calling the police, she helped him. She helped him construct the alibi of the flu. She stood as a lookout while he used his janitorial tools to open the wall. Her hair must have fallen from her sweater and into the bag as they handled Leo's belongings before sealing them away. She was not just a liar who provided a false alibi. She was an active accomplice in the cover-up. She lived with that monstrous secret until the day she died, taking it with her to the grave. Or so she thought. With the culprit's confession, the brutal truth finally came to light, proving that perseverance can overcome decades of silence. If stories of justice like this inspire you, leave a like to support our research. Arthur Gable's confession closed a 30-year-old wound, but justice still demanded its day in court. Extradited back to Oregon, the frail, elderly man who stood before the judge was a pale shadow of the menacing figure who had haunted the town's memory. The trial was swift, faced with his own detailed confession, the corroborating eyewitness testimony of Clara Joyce, and the irrefutable DNA evidence linking his wife to the crime scene. There was no defense Gable could offer. He was found guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the man who had stolen a childhood and lived 3 decades in undeserved freedom would spend the rest of his days behind bars. As he was led from the courtroom, his quiet, suburban life was officially exposed for what it was, a 30-year lie. Based on the precise location from Gable's confession, investigators returned one last time to the derelict shell of Oakhaven Elementary. In a solemn and respectful excavation, they opened the wall in the old art room, the tomb that Gable had created so long ago. The discovery of Leo Miller's remains was a profoundly somber moment, a painful but necessary conclusion to the search. After 30 years of being a ghost, a missing person on a faded poster, Leo Miller was finally coming home. A few weeks later, on a clear, crisp autumn day, eerily similar to the one on which he had vanished, Leo was finally laid to rest. The funeral was a moment of deep and quiet dignity. Sarah and David Miller stood before their family and friends, their faces etched with the sorrow of their loss, but no longer haunted by the torment of the unknown. They were not just burying a 10-year-old boy, they were burying 3 decades of agonizing uncertainty and arrested grief. The community of Oakhaven, both new and old residents, filled the cemetery to pay their respects, bringing a final, communal closure to the town's darkest chapter. The resolution of Leo's case sent shockwaves far beyond the town limits. The horrifying truth that a predator had hidden in plain sight, protected by his position and a flawed system, prompted real change. The Oregon State Legislature, moved by the story, passed a new bill formerly known as the Leo Miller Act. The law mandated not just initial background checks, but rigorous, recurring criminal and psychological screenings for every single school employee, from teachers to administrative staff to janitors. A loophole that had allowed a monster to flourish had been slammed shut, a legacy of safety forged from a tragedy. The story also brought a different kind of closure to Clara Joyce. The immense guilt she had carried since childhood finally began to lift. To honor the boy, she could. Never worn, she channeled her memories and her art into a new project. She created a beautiful, wordless graphic novel, not about the crime, but about a brave, imaginative boy named Leo, who builds a rocket ship and soars across the stars, exploring fantastical worlds. The book, dedicated to the memory of Leo Miller, became an unexpected bestseller, ensuring that his story would be remembered not for the darkness of its end, but for the bright, creative spirit of the boy he was. In the end, peace came to the Miller house, not as a sudden event, but as a slow, gentle dawn after a long night. Sarah Miller could at last begin to heal. The bedroom shrine remained, but it was no longer a place of arrested grief. It was a place of quiet remembrance. The pain of her loss would never vanish, but the gnawing agony of not knowing was finally gone. She had her answers, her son had a final resting place, and his story, in the end, had been told. The story of Leo Miller teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe and let us know in the comments from which city you watched this incredible conclusion.